Hello, beautiful community. We're going to talk about Putin's existential fears because this conversation is always very prominent. I think it helps to ground ourselves a little bit around that. I won't talk about one thing, and that's the sustainability of Russia's economy, because I may do a separate conversation about how a non-Russian and non-economics expert might think about that. And I'm always happy to direct you to other content offline, but even also content in our own bubble here. Friend of the channel Perun did a video on this 2 or 3 weeks ago, and friend of the channel Anders Bach-Nielsen did a video about this a couple of days ago. And if you watch Anders' video, I recommend paying special attention to the last minute of it, where he brings out the question of Ukraine's sustainability, because it's very important that the potential unsustainability of Russia's war economy isn't decisive except in relative connection to the sustainability of the war and economy and political stability for Ukraine. You cannot disconnect the two, right? Otherwise there's a risk for fantastical thinking, which is indeed a danger, because politically what I am often seeing in discourse is a kind of displacement from the tough conversation of the huge challenges Ukraine faces and the insufficiency of Western support for Ukraine to the easier conversation about how Putin is going to lose power next Tuesday, right? And so there is a temptation of a self-congratulatory kind to think that that sort of conversation is pro-Ukraine because it might help Ukraine somehow to go on like that online. It doesn't. More often than not, displaces attention from the serious challenges that we face around the West's lack of strategy and insufficient commitment to Ukraine. Having said this, we will talk about Putin's fragility, but in a sober way in this chat, and Putin's own fears. Now, at a psychological level, Putin's biggest fear is one we already talked about, and that's the kind of Gaddafi picture of being torn from power in a way that is not just politically but biologically terminal for him, as the result of what he would see as an unacceptable projection of US imperial power, not just into Europe and into Ukraine, but into Russia itself. And don't underestimate how far Putin thinks that the Europeans falling in line with the United States on Ukraine is itself just a product of US power exercise. That's to say, this is not in the interests of European powers, but they just do it because they're getting bossed around. Now, before we jump into the political side of Putin's fears, let's say something that actually goes to the heart of this, that's almost a little bit of cartoonish political philosophy. And that's the line that Steve Kotkin often uses, that it's our very existence that constitutes an existential threat to the Russians and the Chinese. Now, what's meant by that is that it's not our escalation, as the Russians might perceive, that threatens them, but our existence, because it's always possible for citizens in Putin's country to ask, why can't we too have things that people in the West have politically, like independent courts, free media, a government you can vote out. And so the philosophical question here is about the normative globalization of liberal democracy versus cultural difference. And in my capacity as a political philosopher, I can tell you this. There is no doubt that cultural difference cuts deep and deeper than most people assume, and that absolutely affects the desirability, but also the feasibility of various political arrangements. Certain political arrangements are only possible because of sustenance of contingent political cultures that are here, but not there, right? Having said this, there is no human on earth, whether they're Chinese or Tongan, for whom it's not an available question to ask, why can't my courts be fair too? Why can't I say what I think in public? Why can't I vote out my government? And so, as soon as a sufficient level of political reflexivity raises that question, it can't be unraised except by a modicum of political repression. And that question is universally available. There is no human who cannot ask it. And that is an ongoing, perennial concern for these authoritarian regimes. Now, don't jump from that to implying that I approve of some of the more fanciful construals of our world as a battle between democracy and authoritarianism. A lot of them are, for me, over-idealized. Now, Putin's biggest political fear is just what we've captured in psychological terms. Losing power because of what is in the final analysis inappropriate projection of US imperial power, as he sees it. Another fear of Putin, and we'll just jump through several, which isn't actually a big fear because he thinks that he's going to be all right on that side, is the West developing a strategy or getting much closer to having a strategy, not just in Ukraine, but in the Middle East, in China, Taiwan. And the reason Putin is optimistic about being okay on that front isn't just because of the anti-Fukuyami and the Fukuyamianism in reverse kind of dogma in the Kremlin about Western decline, but also because he thinks that in the end, US projection of power in Ukraine is irrational for the United States. The United States doesn't have significant interests there. If only it understood its interests properly, it wouldn't be involved. So, Western weakness and in the final analysis that the West doesn't have critical interests at stake in Ukraine, right, makes Putin comfortable that the West will not wake up with a clear strategy about how to defeat him in that part of the world. The next fear Putin has is not having political control over Ukraine in the medium term. And the related fear is Ukraine remaining outside of Russia's political control and politically viable, politically governable. That remains his existential aspiration, because it's not just a West that exists that constitutes a threat to him, but Ukraine too, and Ukraine in a much greater power, actually, because if a 2020 Belarusian type situation occurs in Russia, Putin sees a relatively independent and democratic Ukraine, even if it's not a member of Western alliances, as an existential threat that could tip the situation against his favor and end things for him very badly, politically and biologically. And when you think of what the Russians do militarily, whether on the front lines or in the bombardment of Ukraine's energy system, don't underestimate how much the aspiration there is political, and it's the ungovernability of Ukraine. So just like they're after our ungovernability, which we'll talk about more when it comes to the 24 November US election, but they're after Ukraine's ungovernability tenfold relative to how much they're after ours. A more controversial view is that Putin fears, and it's my view, that the West may not decline sufficiently for Article 5 to be challengeable without the West responding. That's predicated on a couple of assumptions. One is that Putin's regime security is locked into not just escalation, but in some form war, right? That Putin's conception of regime security locks him into not just escalating against us, but being in some kind of war state against us. And you'll see my delight in platforming Mark Galeotti's slightly different view about this on the main channel shortly. And it's also dependent in part on my assumption that there's a tendency to see a big conflict with the West as kind of inevitable in the Kremlin. So that's a more controversial fear that I ascribe to Putin, but other analysts don't. The next fear of Putin's is, of course, elite fragmentation. And part of the reason he started the war was that fear. I argue that he had an impression of losing his power in the sense of increasingly finding himself in the refereeing role between different elites to whom he was outsourcing presidential powers. And then more recently, I updated this with a kind of interpretation about end game positioning when he brought in Belousov into the Ministry of Defense. That's to say that Putin's beginning to think about what form his regime should be in terms of its human content, when the time comes either for Putin to let go of power biologically or politically. So that's a permanent, ongoing, daily fear that he has to manipulate via various kinds of practical machinations. Another paranoid fear I won't talk about is the breakup of Russia. Now, yet another fear is that Putinism will expire with Putin. And that again is one of the causes of the war. That the kind of story they're running isn't a story that they could pass on, including with all the privileges and corrupt resources, to the next generation of the elite. And then a final fear that's always a fear, but it's well controlled at the moment, is fear of the population. And it was actually Gorbachev who once said to Putin, "Why are you afraid of your own people so much?" And what I'd say about that is that two things are keeping Putin safe there for now. One's, of course, the radical depoliticization that we discuss endlessly. But second is that the depoliticized blob that I think are the majority of the Russian population have an instinct that, while they have no clue about what this war is about, and it seems to be a pretty questionable idea, an idea they don't want to get into too much, but it's a questionable idea. Nevertheless, now that it's started, it would be bad for Russia to come out of it with a terrible defeat. Now, going back to the economy, as certain unsustainabilities that are on the horizon manifest, there is going to be a need for more political repression and more totalitarian turns, and that's going to reanimate for Putin this question of fear of his own people. So that's a little bit of a taster of sort of how we begin to think about this. I hope this is helpful. Talk very soon and lots of love.